In the last video, we talked about the elements test. So in this video, let's now talk about the next type of analysis. And the next type of analysis is called the factor analysis. Factor analysis. And we do a factor analysis when our rule is a factor test. A factor test, or what we sometimes call a balancing test. Balancing test, right? In a factor test, we have several components, much like the elements test. But instead of saying that all of the components must be satisfied or one of the components must be satisfied, the factor test requires that all of the components, we call them factors, all of the factors must be considered and then weighed against each other to reach a conclusion. So for example, think about how you decide whether you call someone a friend. How do you decide whether you would consider someone to be a friend? You probably consider several different things in deciding whether someone is a friend as opposed to just a mere acquaintance or just someone that you know. You might consider things like, is the person kind? At least to you. Is the person kind to you? You might consider whether the person is someone with whom you have a lot in common. Okay, that might be another thing that you consider when deciding whether someone is a friend. Maybe you consider whether the person is trustworthy. And let's say that punctuality is really important to you, so you might consider whether the person is punctual. Okay, so there are all these things that you consider, but this is not an elements test. If this were an elements test, if this were a disjunctive elements test, that would mean that a person is a friend if she has just one of these qualities. Just one of the qualities would be enough in a disjunctive elements test. But that isn't true, right? Someone could be punctual, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the person is a friend, right? You could be someone who's punctual but is still not a friend, right? And it's not a conjunctive elements test either, because having all four of these qualities isn't necessarily required for someone to be a friend. Maybe you don't actually have a ton in common with a particular person, but you might still consider that person a friend. Sometimes opposites attract. So this is different from an elements test. What we do with a factor test is we check for each one of these factors which way a particular person cuts, in favor of calling the person a friend or against calling the person a friend. So let's say on this side, let's identify the factors that cut in favor of calling someone a friend, and then on the other side, away from calling someone a friend. And then for each of these factors, we would see whether it cuts in favor of calling the person a friend or not. So let's say we have a particular person. Let's just draw a person here. Hey, am I a friend? I just want to know, do you consider me a friend? Okay, well, let's go through each of these factors and see. Maybe the person is very kind. So that would cut in favor of calling the person a friend. And maybe we don't have that much in common with the person. So that would actually cut away from calling the person a friend. And let's say that she's not really all that trustworthy either. So that also cuts in favor of, or I should say, cuts against calling her a friend. But she's very punctual. So that cuts in favor of calling her a friend. Okay, so after going through each of these factors and deciding which way that particular factor cuts, we then weigh all of the factors all together, to see if on the whole, the person is someone that we consider a friend. Now, when we do a factor test, we don't just count the factors and see which possible outcome has the most factors cutting in favor of that outcome. For one thing, the rule might have an even number of factors, just like we have here in our friend rule. In that case, you might get two factors cutting in favor of friend and two factors cutting away from friend, cutting in favor of not calling the person a friend. And if you were to just count the factors, you'd end up with a tie. Now, another reason that we don't just count factors is that some factors may be more important than others. They may weigh more than the others do in the analysis. So we need to weigh them all together or balance them. That's why the factor test is also called a balancing test. For example, maybe kindness is really important to you. Really important to you. So if a person is very kind, you'd be willing to overlook a lot of these other factors. The person could not have that much in common with you and not be that trustworthy, and just be a little bit punctual, just sometimes. But that might be enough because the kindness is so important to you and the person is so kind. On the other hand, maybe having a lot in common is not that important. It's not that important to you. So as long as this person is at least just a little bit kind and a little bit punctual, even if the person doesn't have a lot in common with you, it's okay. You're willing to overlook it. All right. So how each of the factors is weighed in the overall balancing, you might want to look at some cases to see how courts have weighed these factors in the past to give you a clue about how the different factors should be weighed in a particular factor analysis. So the way that we organize a memo around a factor test is pretty similar to what we do for an elements test. We're still following the IRAC formula. So we start with the issue and the rule. And then when we get to the analysis part of our memo, the A in IRAC, we write a separate heading for each factor. So we had the kindness factor, a lot in common factor, the trustworthiness factor, and finally the punctuality. How punctual is this person? These were the factors that we considered. All right? And after we do this, for each one of these factors, we write a separate heading and we analyze each factor individually using the IRAC format for each one. So each one of these factors has its own sub-IRAC to determine whether the factor cuts in favor of calling the person a friend or against calling the person a friend. But the difference between how we do a factor analysis and an elements analysis is after we've identified each of the factors and IRAC'd each one, we then have another step. We add a step of weighing all of the different factors against each other or balancing them. Okay, so we explain how we balance them. So not just which way they cut, but, well, kindness is really important, so even though the person is not that trustworthy and not that punctual and only have a little bit in common with us, that's okay. And we still say on the whole the person is a friend, for example. Okay, so on the whole, after weighing all of the factors, we decide whether the person is a friend or is not a friend. And then we give our conclusion. The person is or is not a friend.